And one day, a monster would kneel in the dirt before her. The metallic tang of a ruined empire coating the back of her throat. A feral beast, a king feared by gods and men, bowing his massive head, exposing his throat to her in absolute submission. Her glowing violet eyes staring down at him. The mechanical siphon ground its gears and the vision shattered. Cold reality slammed back into Lyra's bones. The cellar air was freezing, smelling of ancient rust and damp earth. She didn't know the color of the sky. In 22 years she had never seen it. But she knew the exact shade of crimson her blood made as it pumped through the clear, stained tubes looping from her veins into the glass vats. Thick silver cuffs bit deep into the raw skin of her wrists, pinning her arms above her head. She hung there in the gloom. The runt. The blood farm. Just another forgotten husk keeping the vampire Lord Severin eternally young. Her heart gave a weak flutter as the machine drew another agonizing pull. Deep inside her chest something scratched. A phantom claw scraping against the back of her ribs. Wolf. The suppressed spirit she had spent her entire life burying paced in the cage of her soul. It was starving mostly because she was feeding a god. Hush, she begged the beast silently. If Severin discovered she wasn't just a regenerative freak, if he realized she carried the lost magic of the Lunar Oracles, he wouldn't just drain her blood. He would peel her soul apart. The machine sputtered. A rusted valve slipped. A single drop of blood leaked from the fitting, falling through the dark to hit a withered root creeping up through a crack in the stone floor. The dry husk shuddered. Vibrant violet veins spiderwebbed up the dead stem. Leaves unfurled, slick and pulsing, and a flower erupted in the pitch-black dungeon. Panic flooded Lyra's mouth with a sharp copper taste. She couldn't hide it. She couldn't reach it to crush it. Heavy footsteps echoed down the stone corridor. The rusted iron door groaned open and the temperature in the room plummeted. The cloying scent of vanilla and stale blood rolled into the cell. Severin had arrived. The vampire lord glided into the flickering torchlight, a creature woven from velvet and old money. He paused, his pitch-black eyes locking onto the glowing violet flower blooming from the stone. Lyra squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the strike. The kick to the ribs. The agony. Instead, Severin stepped close, his boots crunching against the dirt. He reached down and plucked the bloom, bringing it to his nose. Magnificent, he purred, his voice like a silken razor. All these years hoarding such a potent vintage right beneath my nose. A lunar descendant. He stepped up to her. Icy fingers wrapped around her jaw, tilting her head up forcefully. The cold radiating off his skin burned her cheeks. Your blood has kept me strong, little runt. But this... He crushed the flower in his fist, killing the violet light. This core of yours will make me a god. He leaned in, fangs grazing the shell of her ear. The extraction ritual begins at midnight. We will tear the magic from your marrow. It will be excruciating. And then you will finally be allowed to die. Releasing her, Severin wiped his hand on his immaculate coat. He turned to the hulking vampire guard lingering in the doorway. Bleed her dry. Bring her up when the grand clock chimes 12. The heavy iron door slammed shut. The lock clicked. Inside Lyra's chest, the phantom wolf let out a furious snarl. It slammed against her ribs, demanding survival. For years she had chosen passive endurance. She had chosen to be prey. In the courtyard above, the massive clock began to toll. Bong. The guard stepped forward, unsheathing a jagged silver knife to cut the final tubes. Bong. A terrifying clarity washed over her. She looked at her left hand, then at the heavy silver ring locked around her wrist. It was too tight to slip. Bong. Lyra twisted her arm, bracing the heel of her hand against the cold stone wall. She locked her gaze on the approaching guard. Breathe. Push. She threw her entire body weight against the angle of her thumb. The sickening crunch of her own bone echoed in the small cell. Agony exploded up her arm, blinding her, stealing the air from her lungs. She choked on a scream, swallowing the blood from her bitten tongue. Her thumb hung at a grotesque angle. With a wet slide of tearing skin, she yanked her hand through the silver cuff. She was free. The heavy silver chain dropped, swinging wildly. The guard blinked, his crimson eyes widening in shock. Lyra didn't give him time to shout. Driven by the starving beast inside her, she gripped the chain attached to her right wrist and whipped her body forward. The thick silver cuff on the end arced through the air like a flail. Solid metal met the vampire's temple with a hollow crack. Bone shattered and he crumpled to the floor. Trembling, gasping through the pain of her broken hand, Lyra dropped to her knees. She fumbled through the guard's pockets with her good hand, her bloody fingers slipping on the cold metal keys until the right cuff fell away. She ran. Bare feet slapped against freezing wet stone as she tore up the spiraling servant stairs. The castle was quiet, but the air was thick with the oppressive weight of waking monsters. She burst through a heavy wooden door and hit the outer parapets. The wind hit her like a physical blow. It howled, vicious and biting, immediately slicing through her thin tunic. The forbidden waste stretched out endlessly below, a jagged nightmare of black ice, dark pines and freezing mud. Behind her an alarm bell shattered the night. They had found the guard. Shouts echoed up the stairwell, followed by the hammering of heavy boots against stone. Lyra looked down over the edge of the wall. The drop was a sheer cliff face plummeting into a blanket of snow and jagged rocks. A normal human would die on impact. But she wasn't entirely human. The agonizing throb in her left hand was already changing. The bones ground together, knitting back into place with a sickening heat as her oracle blood forced the healing process. The door to the parapet rattled. Better to die a free smear on the rocks than fuel a monster on an altar. Lyra climbed onto the frozen stone ledge. The wind whipped her hair wildly around her face. She closed her eyes, took one final breath and stepped off the edge. Gravity ripped the breath from her lungs. The wind screamed in her ears until she hit the canopy of a massive pine tree. Thick branches whipped and tore at her skin, slowing her momentum before she slammed into the deep snowbank below. Pain radiated through her entire body. Ribs cracked. Lungs burned. She forced herself to roll over, spitting blood and snow into the mud. She had to move. Then the sound carried on the wind. A high, unnatural baying. Vampire hounds. They had caught the scent of her spilled blood. The hunt was on. Her lungs burned like shattered glass. Lyra scrambled up a steep embankment, her numb fingers clawing at the frozen roots of the black pines. Every breath was a jagged knife. The snow beneath her bare feet had turned from white to a smeared crimson. The shrieking bay of the hounds was closer now. A heavy weight slammed into her spine. Lyra pitched forward, her face smashing into the frozen mud. Before she could push up, a heavy leather boot slammed between her shoulder blades, pinning her flush against the ground. The rotting scent of Severin's court filled her nose. Look at the little blood bag crawl. 3 trackers circled her, their eyes glowing a sickly, pale red in the darkness. The one standing on her back leaned his weight down, grinding her bruised ribs into the rocks. Lord Severin said to bring her back alive. Another tracker sneered, crouching down to grab a fistful of her hair. He yanked her head back. He didn't say in what condition. He backhanded her across the jaw. Her vision flashed white and the metallic taste of fresh blood flooded her mouth. She slumped back into the snow, trembling uncontrollably as the cold sank into her bones. The tracker kicked her hard in the stomach. Lyra curled into a tight ball, wrapping her healed left hand over her face. She was completely broken. Exhausted. She was going to be dragged back to the cellar in chains, a hollow husk waiting for the midnight ritual. Tie her legs, the first tracker spat. I'll drag her by the hair. Before the clink of chains could sound, the atmosphere shifted. A massive shadow blotted out the pale moonlight. The biting wind of the wastes vanished and the temperature in the clearing spiked. The freezing mud beneath her cheek began to steam. A heavy scent of ozone and bruised pine saturated the air. The trackers froze, their pale red eyes darting to the tree line. A low rumble vibrated through the earth. It wasn't a sound. It was an earthquake trapped in a throat. The canopy above them exploded. A massive figure dropped from the shadows, landing with enough force to crater the ice beneath his boots. Lyra flinched, curling tighter into the mud. He didn't speak or hesitate. Moving with terrifying, blinding speed, he lunged at the tracker holding the chains. A massive hand clamped around the vampire's throat. With a brutal flick of his wrist, bones snapped and the tracker dropped like a stone. The other 2 hissed, drawing silver blades. The stranger stepped into their path. He was huge, shoulders broad enough to block out the sky, muscles straining against a scarred leather harness. A blade pierced his bicep. He didn't even blink. He gripped the vampire's arm and ripped it out of the socket. the air filled with the sound of tearing flesh and agonizing screams. Lyra pressed her hands over her ears, her heart hammering against her ribs. He was trading one monster for another. This was a feral beast, a Lycan. Once he finished with them, he would turn on her. The final tracker tried to run. The stranger caught him by the spine and hurled him effortlessly against a jagged boulder. The crack of the impact echoed through the dead forest. Then absolute silence. The tension broke, leaving a ringing stillness in the clearing. Lyra kept her eyes squeezed shut. She trembled in the mud, waiting for the heavy boots to stop beside her head. Waiting for the final strike. The boots approached, stopping just inches from her face. She braced herself. The stranger slowly dropped to one knee. He didn't reach for her. He positioned his massive body perfectly between her and the mangled bodies of the trackers, forming a wall of heat and muscle. Lyra forced her eyes open. He was staring down at her. His eyes were a piercing molten gold. A fierce, predatory fire burned behind them, but the hands resting on his knees were completely still. "Mine to protect," he rumbled. The deep, gravelly timbre of his voice vibrated straight through her chest. The adrenaline finally gave out. The freezing mud rushed up to meet her and Lyra slipped into the dark. Heat. Dry, crackling heat. Lyra gasped, her eyes flying open. She wasn't in the mud. She was lying on a massive bed of thick pelts. The scent of wood smoke and rain-soaked fur wrapped around her like a heavy blanket. Her body moved on instinct. She scrambled backward, pressing her spine hard against the rough canvas wall of the large tent. Her eyes darted around the space, taking in weapon racks and heavy iron braziers burning with bright orange flames. "You're safe." She whipped her head toward the sound. He sat across the tent, perched carefully on the edge of a sturdy wooden stool that looked far too small for him. In the firelight she could finally see him clearly. His face was rugged, marred by a faded, jagged scar slicing across his jaw. He wore a simple, unlaced tunic, the fabric stretched tight across his chest. Lyra pulled her knees to her chest, assessing the exits. Assessing the threat. Kaelen didn't move toward her. He stared at her with those golden eyes, his jaw clenched tight. He was holding himself back. She could feel the crushing weight of his aura pressing against the walls of the tent, yet his massive hands rested flat on his thighs, completely open. He slowly reached beside him, picking up a steaming wooden bowl and extended it toward her. His hand was trembling. Just a fraction. A microscopic tremor of a predator fighting its deepest instincts just to hand her a meal. Lyra swallowed hard. She didn't reach for it. If she ate his food, she owed him. If she owed him, she was trapped. The heavy flap of the tent was shoved aside. A tall, lean man stepped inside. He lacked Kaelen's sheer mass, but his posture was coiled and dangerous. Gideon. His sharp eyes immediately bypassed Kaelen and locked onto Lyra. He didn't look at her like a rescued victim. He looked at her like a very complicated puzzle. "The perimeter is secure, Alpha," Gideon said smoothly, though his eyes never left Lyra's face. "The trackers were Severins. Which begs the question." He tilted his head, his nostrils flaring slightly. "What exactly is a blood farm doing all the way out in our woods?" The freezing water bit deep into her knuckles. Lyra knelt in the slush at the edge of the Blood Moon encampment, scrubbing a rusted iron pot with handfuls of coarse sand. Her hands were raw, but she didn't care. The physical pain grounded her. She kept her head down. Invisible. The moment a blood farm made themselves useful, they became property. All around her, the pack moved with chaotic energy. Two massive enforcers wrestled near the fire pits, their chests rumbling with heavy chuffs. A younger wolf snapped at a stolen piece of meat, only to be met with a sharp warning bark from an elder. There were no chains here. No silver cuffs. Just raw loyalty masked by teeth and claws. It made her stomach twist with a dangerous yearning. Lyra reached into the cold fire pit beside her, scooped up a handful of gray ash, and rubbed it roughly over the pulse points on her neck and wrists. A desperate camouflage. If they smelled the rich tang of her lunar blood, the fragile illusion of her safety would shatter. A frantic shout tore through the tree line. "Move. Clear the path." Lyra dropped the pot and scrambled back against a stack of chopped wood. 4 scarred wolves burst into the clearing, carrying a makeshift stretcher of pine branches and torn canvas. On it lay Kaelen. His massive chest heaved with shallow, ragged breaths. The fading sunlight hit his skin, revealing a horrifying network of pitch-black veins spiderwebbing up his neck. The scent of ozone and pine was gone, replaced by the sour stench of rotting magic. "The curse is spreading," one of the enforcers snarled, panic breaking his voice. "Get the healer." They rushed him toward the largest tent in the center of the camp. Lyra stood frozen in the snow. She recognized that decay. It was the feral curse, a dark magic rot that slowly consumed an alpha's mind until only a mindless monster remained. And she knew exactly how to cure it. The healer's tent smelled of burning sage, crushed mint, and death. Lyra lingered in the shadows just outside the heavy canvas flap, peering through a narrow slit in the fabric. Kaelen writhed on the heavy furs. His golden eyes were rolled back, his jaw clamped shut in agonizing pain. An elderly woman with scarred hands frantically packed a foul-smelling poultice against his chest, but the black veins simply pulsed, creeping closer to his heart. "It's eating him from the inside," the healer whispered. Gideon paced at the foot of the bed, his hands clenched into tight fists. "Try the wolfsbane root again. There has to be a way to slow it down." "I am out of root," the healer snapped. "I have to fetch more from the drying racks. Keep him still." She shoved past Gideon and hurried out the back of the tent. A moment later, Gideon cursed under his breath, turning on his heel to follow her. The tent was empty. The beast trapped behind Lyra's ribs let out a desperate whine. "Go." She stepped through the canvas flap. The rotting magic radiating from Kaelen made her eyes water, but underneath the decay she felt the hum of his soul. A chaotic, desperate frequency begging for an anchor. Her vision suddenly tinted a brilliant violet as the dormant oracle magic in her blood recognized the dark curse and surged forward to consume it. "If I do this, I become a battery again." She stared down at his ruined, gasping chest. He had stepped between her and the monsters. He had bled for a stranger. Her body moved on instinct. Lyra drew the jagged edge of her thumbnail across her own wrist. The skin parted and a single drop of rich crimson blood welled up. She leaned over the massive alpha, her hand trembling, and let the drop fall directly onto the darkest cluster of black veins over his heart. The blood sizzled like acid on hot iron. A flash of violet light erupted beneath his skin. The black veins hissed and violently receded as the ancient magic eradicated the dark rot in seconds. Kaelen's chest stopped heaving. His molten gold eyes snapped open. He moved too fast for the human eye to track. A massive hand clamped around Lyra's throat, and the world spun in a blur of canvas and shadow. Her spine slammed against the wooden support pole of the tent. The breath exploded from her lungs in a choked gasp. Kaelen caged her entirely against the wood. The feral curse was gone, but the beast in his eyes was fully awake. His chest pressed flush against hers, his heart hammering a violent rhythm against her ribs. He didn't squeeze her throat. The grip was a restraint, not an attack. He leaned down, burying his face directly into the crook of her neck and inhaled sharply. The deep, shuddering breath seemed to pull the air out of her lungs. Lyra squeezed her eyes shut, paralyzed by a terrifying mixture of panic and a sudden spike of heat pooling low in her stomach. The scent of pine and dominant alpha washed over her. He smelled the magic. He knew. "What are you?" Kaelen rumbled against her collarbone, his voice rough as grinding stones. "Let me go," she whispered, her voice cracking. Kaelen pulled back just enough to look at her, tracking the raw terror vibrating through her frame. He looked down at the bleeding cut on her wrist, then back to the fading black rot on his own chest. Realization washed over his rugged features. Not a battery. A tether. His thumb gently brushed the sensitive skin beneath her jaw. "Mine," he breathed, a heavy vibrating vow. The tension broke the moment a shadow fell across the dirt floor. Gideon stood in the entrance of the tent, holding a bundle of dried roots. His calculating eyes locked onto Kaelen's clear, healed chest, and then shifted entirely to the bloody cut on Lyra's wrist. He didn't say a word. He just smiled. The heavy canvas flap fell shut as Gideon backed out of the tent, his cold smile lingering in the air long after he was gone. The suffocating tension snapped back to Kaelen. The massive alpha stood perfectly still, his broad chest rising and falling with deep, even breaths. He looked down at Lyra, tracking the frantic pulse jumping at the base of her throat. "Tell me what you are." His voice dropped to a vibrating rumble that demanded obedience. Lyra pressed her shoulders harder against the wooden support pole, quickly pulling her sleeve down to hide the cut. The phantom wolf inside her paced, eager to bare its teeth, but trauma demanded she hide. "I have hedgewitch blood," she lied, keeping her voice steady. "My blood carries a minor mending property. I heal fast. That is all." Kaelen didn't blink. He closed the distance with a single step, caging her against the wood again. The intense heat radiating from his massive frame sent a shiver straight down her spine. He lowered his face to her neck, drawing in a long, deliberate breath. "You smell like the moon, little witch," Kaelen murmured, his lips brushing the shell of her ear. "You smell like raw power and ancient fire. Not weeds." Lyra's breath hitched. Her heart hammered a chaotic rhythm. She was drowning in the heavy scent of petrichor and pure, restrained danger. "I healed you," she whispered, barely holding together. "Let me leave." Kaelen pulled back to catch her gaze. "You healed an alpha. You bled for this pack. That makes you mine to protect. You aren't leaving these woods." A piercing shriek shattered the quiet of the camp. The warding alarms. Kaelen's demeanor shifted instantly. The possessive warmth vanished, replaced by the calculating cold of an apex predator. He spun away, snatching a heavy broadsword from the weapon rack. "Stay in the shadows," he ordered, tearing through the tent flap. The perimeter had fallen. Smoke choked the air, thick and suffocating. Lyra stumbled out of the healer's tent into a nightmare. The Blood Moon camp was tearing itself apart. Heavy iron braziers were overturned, spilling blazing coals across the slush. Ozone. Burning flesh. The sharp, metallic tang of spilled blood. Vampire scouts moved like blurs of dark smoke through the trees, their pale faces illuminated by the fires. The night was a chaotic symphony of snarling wolves and the sickening ring of clashing steel. Her body moved on instinct. She ducked behind a stack of wooden crates as a vampire tracker hurled a pack enforcer through a canvas wall. "Run," her mind screamed. She scrambled on her hands and knees toward the dark edge of the tree line. Just a few more yards. Well. "Found you." A vampire dropped from the canopy directly into her path. He drew a weeping silver blade, his red eyes locked onto her throat. He lunged. A small, gray blur slammed into the vampire's side. A young pack member, hardly more than a boy, tackled the immortal into the slush. The boy snarled, tearing at the vampire's face with half-shifted claws. It was a brave, desperate, entirely foolish attack. The vampire hissed, easily flipping the boy over. The jagged silver blade plunged straight down into his chest. Lyra screamed. Ripping the blade free, the vampire kicked the boy aside like trash. The young wolf hit the frozen mud, blood bubbling past his lips. His wide, terrified eyes locked onto Lyra. He was dying. He had sacrificed his life for a coward hiding in the dirt. The guilt hit her like a physical blow, shattering the mental walls she had built over 22 years of captivity. The terror of her own power was eclipsed by the agony of watching this boy bleed out. No more hiding. Lyra crawled frantically through the slush and threw herself over the boy's ruined chest. Her hands ignited with blinding violet fire. The heat radiating from her skin was terrifying. Lyra didn't suppress the beast inside her anymore. She threw the cage doors wide open. The phantom wolf roared, merging with her marrow, flooding her veins with the unadulterated magic of the Lunar Oracles. The blinding violet light engulfed the boy. The deep wound in his chest hissed as bones snapped aggressively back into place. Torn flesh fused together in seconds. The boy gasped, his lungs expanding as life slammed back into his body. The vampire tracker staggered backward, shielding his red eyes from the light. "What are you?" he shrieked, raising his silver blade. Lyra slowly stood up. The slush hissed and melted into steam beneath her bare feet. The violet fire crawled up her forearms, bleeding into her eyes until the world was bathed in brilliant purple. She didn't speak. She extended one glowing hand toward the vampire, and a shockwave of raw lunar magic erupted from her palm. It slammed into the tracker's chest with the force of a falling star. The vampire didn't even have time to scream before he was vaporized, leaving nothing behind but a cloud of drifting gray ash. A heavy, dead silence blanketed that corner of the battlefield. Lyra stood panting, the violent fire slowly receding beneath her skin. She looked up to find the fighting had stopped. Every surviving wolf in the vicinity was staring at her. Kaelen stood 50 feet away, his broadsword dripping with dark blood. He stared at her awestruck, the realization of what she truly was finally settling over his features. She wasn't just a witch. She was a living god. Lyra's breath trembled. The secret was out. She turned her head and saw Gideon leaning against a ruined wagon in the shadows. He wasn't looking at the ash, he was looking directly at Lyra. His dark eyes gleamed with calculation, weighing exactly how much a living lunar oracle would buy him on the open market. Her stomach dropped. There was no going back to the shadows now. The drifting gray ash had not even settled on the snow. Lyra stood in the center of the ruined courtyard, her hands still faintly glowing. The surviving pack elders formed a tight, suffocating ring around her, their eyes wide with a mixture of awe and absolute terror. A lunar oracle was a beacon for every dark creature on the continent. She is a walking target, an elder with a scarred snout snarled, taking a slow step toward her. If Severin knows she is here, he will burn this forest to the root. We must lock her in the deep cells. Subdue her magic before it draws the rest of his army. Lyra's chest tightened. She took a step back, the phantom wolf inside her baring its teeth. They were going to cage her. She had saved their boy and they were going to put her right back in the dark. The air pressure in the courtyard shifted as Kaelen stepped into the ring. He stalked forward, his broadsword dripping onto the white snow, and placed his massive frame directly in front of Lyra. The first man who reaches for her, Kaelen rumbled, his voice dropping to a lethal register. I remove the hand at the wrist. The elder flinched, baring his throat in instant submission. Alpha, her power. Her power saved my life, Kaelen interrupted, sweeping his golden eyes over the council. Her power saved your kin. She is under my absolute protection. Anyone who questions her freedom questions my right to lead. Lyra stared at the broad expanse of his back. He was risking a mutiny, staking his entire political survival on a girl he barely knew, simply because she had bled for him. True power didn't cage you. True power stood beside you. Kaelen turned. He didn't ask for permission. He reached out, his calloused fingers wrapping gently around her trembling hand. He pulled her through the crowd, leading her away from the staring eyes and straight toward his private quarters. The heavy canvas flap dropped closed, muting the chaotic sounds of the camp. Lyra stood awkwardly in the center of Kaelen's tent, enveloped in the smell of wood smoke, leather and rain. Kaelen unbuckled his sword belt, letting the heavy steel clatter to the wooden floorboards. The rigid alpha persona he wore for the pack melted right off his shoulders. He looked exhausted. Sinking onto the edge of his heavy fur-lined bed, he buried his face in his hands. I was losing my mind, he whispered into the quiet air. Lyra hesitated, then took a slow step closer. The feral curse, he continued, lifting his head. It was eating my memories. My control. I was terrified I would wake up one night and tear my own pack apart. You gave me my mind back. Lyra swallowed the knot in her throat and sank onto the furs beside him. I didn't know the color of the sky until yesterday, she confessed softly, the words tearing their way out of her chest. Severin chained me in the dark. I was a blood farm to keep him young. I thought my magic only existed to feed monsters. Kaelen's jaw clenched tight. He shifted, reaching up to trace the faded, bruised line of the silver cuffs on her wrist with a rough thumb. You are not a battery, he murmured, his voice dropping to a rough whisper. You are the most terrifying, beautiful thing I have ever seen. He leaned in, the magnetic pull between them undeniable. Lyra's breath hitched as his forehead rested against hers. She closed her eyes, entirely surrendering to the safety of his massive frame. For the first time in her life, she let herself rest. When Lyra woke, the fire had died to glowing embers. The heavy pelts were warm, but the space beside her was empty. She blinked into the darkness as an icy prickle of dread washed down her spine. The air in the tent had changed. Beneath the lingering scent of wood smoke, there was something cloying. Vanilla and rotting magic. Severin's scent. Lyra's blood ran cold. She slipped silently from the bed, grabbing a heavy woolen cloak and crept out of the tent into the freezing night. The camp was asleep, save for a few perimeter guards, and Kaelen was nowhere to be seen. She followed the sickly sweet trail of vanilla through the dark trees, straight to the edge of the encampment. Toward Gideon's tent. Crouching behind a snow-covered wagon, her breath pluming in the freezing air, She noticed a faint red light pulsing through a gap in the canvas flap. She crept closer, pressing her ear to the fabric. "The tracker squad was a failure, my lord," Gideon's voice whispered, tight with frustration. Lyra peeked through the slit. Gideon knelt on the dirt floor in front of a dark silver basin filled with bubbling crimson blood. "A blood mirror." Severin's silken voice echoed out of the basin. "Your pack is feral, Gideon. You promised me the oracle. Hand her over, and I will give you the cure to save your wretched people from the rot." "She is heavily guarded," Gideon hissed. "Kaelen refuses to leave her side. But I have isolated the eastern ward stones. If you bring your main force, the perimeter will fall in seconds. I just want the cure." "Done." Severin's voice dripped with sadistic glee. "Burn the camp." Lyra slapped her hand over her mouth. Gideon was inviting the entire vampire army straight into the heart of the Blood Moon pack. She had to warn Kaelen. She spun around, her foot catching on a hidden root. The sound was deafening in the quiet night. Inside the tent, the red light instantly vanished. "Who's there?" Gideon barked. The ground violently heaved beneath her feet. A concussive explosion shattered the silence of the forest. Blinding orange fire erupted from the eastern tree line, throwing Lyra backward into the slush. The protective wards surrounding the camp shrieked like dying animals as they shattered into a million pieces. The perimeter was gone. Ash fell from the sky like dirty snow. Lyra scrambled out of the freezing slush, her ears ringing a high pitch from the explosion. The eastern half of the encampment was a wall of roaring orange flame. Panic flooded the air, sharp and metallic. Severin's elite strike force poured through the shattered wards, shredding tents and cutting down pack members before they could fully shift. "Lyra!" A massive hand grabbed her shoulder, yanking her out of the path of a swinging silver axe. Kaelen stood over her, his broadsword already slicked to the hilt with dark blood. Before she could speak, a familiar voice echoed over the roar of the fire. "Stand down, Alpha. It's over." Gideon stepped out of the thick black smoke. A dozen elite vampire warriors fanned out behind him, their red eyes locked tightly on Lyra. Kaelen's jaw clenched so hard the bone popped. He shifted his massive frame, shielding her from Gideon's view. "You sold your own blood to a parasite. I bought our survival," Gideon spat, raising a jagged blade dripping with a viscous black liquid. "Hand her over and Severin gives us the cure. Fight me and you burn." "Fight!" the phantom wolf inside Lyra roared, clawing desperately at her ribs. "Burn them all." Lyra squeezed her eyes shut and raised her hands, trying to summon the blinding violet fire. But as the heat sparked in her palms, the terrifying memory of reducing a man to drifting ash slammed into her chest. If she let go completely, what would she become? She hesitated. The magic sputtered out. Gideon lunged. He didn't aim for Kaelen. He aimed directly for Lyra's unprotected chest. Kaelen violently shoved her backward into the snow, twisting his body to throw himself directly into the path of the strike. The jagged blade sank deep into Kaelen's side. Kaelen dropped to his knees. The heavy broadsword slipped from his fingers, clattering against the frozen dirt. The thick black poison from Gideon's blade instantly spiderwebbed up his neck, racing furiously toward his heart. It wasn't just venom, it was concentrated dark magic. Lyra screamed, crawling frantically through the slush toward him. "Get her," Gideon commanded as the vampire warriors closed in. Kaelen looked up at Lyra, his chest heaving. He couldn't fight them like this. The poison was paralyzing his human form. There was only one way to survive the venom and slaughter the monsters surrounding her. He had to surrender to the beast. "Kaelen, no." Lyra sobbed, grabbing his trembling shoulders. "Don't let it in." He brushed his calloused thumb across her cheek one last time. Then he let the feral curse consume him entirely. The transformation was horrific, snapping bone and tearing flesh. Kaelen's spine arched backward with a sickening crunch. He exploded into a towering, grotesque lichen, a jagged mountain of matted black fur and agonizing rot. The feral monster let out a deafening roar that shook the earth and tore into the vampire warriors with mindless violence. Bodies were ripped in half, silver blades shattered against his corrupted hide. Gideon turned and fled into the smoke. In seconds the clearing was a graveyard. The feral lichen stood in the center of the carnage, panting heavily, dark blood dripping from his massive jaws. He slowly turned his hulking head toward Lyra. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She took a tentative step forward. "Kaelen, it's me." The beast stared at her. The protective gold was gone, replaced by dead, milky white voids of pure rage. He didn't see his mate. He saw prey. The monster lunged for her. Cold, heavy iron snapped violently around Lyra's throat. A thick chain jerked her backward into a suffocating chest that smelled of cloying vanilla. Severin whispered against her ear, "Time to go home, little runt." The world blurred into a chaotic nightmare. Severin dragged her backward by the iron collar as Lyra choked, her fingers clawing desperately at the thick metal biting into her windpipe. Through the stinging smoke, she watched the devastation of the Blood Moon Pack. Surviving enforcers swarmed the clearing, throwing heavy silver chains over the thrashing monstrosity that used to be Kaelen. He fought them mindlessly, tearing through his own people in a blind, feral rage. Lyra's vision swam with tears. Kaelen had sacrificed his mind, his soul, his humanity to protect her, and running had only brought ruin to everyone she loved. The smoke swallowed her entirely. The rhythmic, grinding pull of the mechanical siphon echoed in the dark. Cold stone. Freezy air. Lyra opened her eyes. The heavy silver cuffs bit deep into the raw skin of her wrists, pinning her arms above her head. The cellar smelled of ancient rust and damp earth. The exact same dungeon. The exact same chains. She hung there, staring at the withered root creeping up through the crack in the stone floor. The heavy iron door groaned open. Severin glided into the torchlight, holding a hollow silver needle attached to a thick glass vial. He smiled, a terrifying display of needle-sharp fangs. "You see now, little battery?" he purred. "This is where you belong. You break everything you touch. You are a curse disguised as a god. Let us finally drain this magic from your marrow." A profound clarity washed over Lyra. She looked at the needle, then at the monster standing before her. The fear was gone. The trauma, the learned helplessness, the paralyzing terror of her own strength. It was all burned away by the devastating loss of the man she loved. If embracing her power made her a monster, then so be it. The world needed a monster right now. Lyra slowly lifted her head. She didn't flinch. She stared directly into Severin's dead eyes, and her own irises ignited with violent, blinding violet fire. The hollow silver needle hovered just inches from Lyra's collarbone. Severin smiled, the torchlight catching the sadistic gleam in his dark eyes. The scent of cloying vanilla and rotting magic was thick enough to choke on. "Don't look at me like that, little battery," Severin murmured, his icy breath brushing her cheek. "You never had a choice. A vessel doesn't decide who drinks from it." He pressed the needle against her skin. A sharp prick of pain. For 22 years, that pain had been her cue to dissociate, to retreat into the darkest corners of her mind and wait for the agony to end. She had spent her entire life terrified of the wolf trapped behind her ribs, believing her power only existed to ruin. But as the needle broke her skin, she didn't retreat. She thought of Kaelen's molten gold eyes. She thought of his massive body stepping between her and the fatal strike, willingly sacrificing his soul to the feral dark just to buy her a few seconds of breath. Lyra closed her eyes. She finally stopped fighting the cage. "Take it," she whispered to the starving god inside her. "Take it all." The beast merged with her mind. Her marrow ignited, and the ancient power of the Lunar Oracles flooded her veins as a weapon. The dungeon spiked in temperature. Severin gasped, ripping his hand back. The heavy silver cuffs binding her wrists began to glow a white-hot cherry red. The thick metal hissed, turning soft and pliable. "What are you doing?" Severin snapped, taking a rapid step backward. Lyra opened her eyes. The room was bathed in brilliant violet light bleeding directly from her irises. She flexed her wrists, and the ancient silver cuffs melted into slag. Molten metal dripped onto the stone floor, hissing as it burned through the rock. Lyra lowered her arms. She wasn't trembling anymore. Severin bared his fangs, his face twisting into a mask of immortal rage. "You arrogant little runt." He lunged for her throat. Lyra didn't flinch. She backhanded him. The concussive force of her newly unleashed physical strength caught the vampire lord entirely off guard. The strike sent him flying across the cell. He slammed into the stone wall, the impact cracking the masonry. Lyra stepped forward, the slush on the floor instantly evaporating beneath her glowing skin. The blood farm was dead. The predator was awake. A massive boom shook the foundations of the castle. Dust and loose mortar rained down from the ceiling, coating Lyra's shoulders. The heavy iron door of the cell rattled against its hinges. Another boom. Closer this time. Then the sound carried down the spiraling stone stairwell. A visceral, earth-shattering roar. It was jagged and wet with blood, echoing with the chaotic fury of a completely feral beast. But beneath the madness, Lyra heard the stuttering rhythm of a failing heart. Kaelen. He was here. He had brought the surviving Blood Moon Pack to the gates of hell itself, tearing through Severin's army in an apocalyptic rage. But the dark curse was burning him out. He was dying to reach her. Panic replaced the cold fury in her chest. Lyra walked toward the iron door. Violet fire crawled up her forearms, weaving through her fingers like liquid stars. She pressed both palms flat against the rusted iron. Burn. A shock wave of lunar magic erupted from her hands. The heavy iron door blew completely off its hinges, rocketing down the corridor and smashing into the far wall with a deafening crash. Lyra stepped out of the cell. The castle was a symphony of chaos, shouts, the sickening ring of clashing steel, the heavy scent of spilled blood pouring down the stone steps. She took the stairs two at a time, moving with impossible fluid grace. The wolf inside her was tracking the scent of petrichor, dragging her relentlessly toward her mate. Vampire guards flooded down the stairwell to intercept her. Lyra didn't slow her pace. She raised her glowing hands, and the narrow corridor became a tunnel of blinding violet fire. She swept through them like a scythe through dry grass, leaving nothing but drifting gray ash in her wake. She reached the heavy oak doors of the main courtyard. The roaring outside was deafening as the battle tore the fortress apart. Lyra kicked the doors open and stepped out into the freezing night. The courtyard was an absolute slaughterhouse. Black ice and snow were painted in dark crimson as the surviving Blood Moon enforcers fought a losing battle against Severin's elite vanguard. But Lyra's glowing eyes bypassed the chaos, locking immediately onto the center of the courtyard. Kaelen. The towering Lycan was on his knees, covered in weeping wounds, surrounded by the mangled bodies of dozens of vampires. His matted fur was slick with blood. He let out a weak chuff, trying to force his massive frame upward, but his muscles were failing. The dark magic venom had reached his heart. Standing just out of his reach was Severin, wiping soot from his velvet coat. Beside him stood Gideon, smiling as he held a thick glass vial filled with a shimmering silver liquid. The cure. A magnificent beast, Severin drawled, drawing a long broadsword. But rabid dogs must be put down. Gideon, enjoy your prize. Severin raised the massive blade, stepping toward Kaelen's exposed neck. The freezing wind died instantly, replaced by a blistering heat. Severin. Lyra's voice wasn't loud, but it echoed across the stones with the heavy weight of absolute authority. Severin froze. Gideon's smug smile vanished, his eyes widening in sheer horror. Lyra walked down the grand stone steps. She was no longer wearing the rags of a victim. She was draped in an aura of pure lunar magic. Violet fire traced the veins up her neck, illuminating her face in an ethereal glow. Kaelen's feral eyes slowly rolled toward her, a weak whine escaping his bloody jaws. The blood farm. Gideon whispered, stumbling backward. That's impossible. Lyra didn't look at Severin. Her eyes locked entirely on the traitor who had poisoned her alpha. She raised a single glowing finger and pointed directly at Gideon's chest. Burn. Gideon's chest simply erupted. Silver lunar fire exploded outward from his ribs. He didn't even have time to scream as the blinding light consumed him, turning his flesh, bones, and treacherous heart into a pillar of swirling white ash. The vial of cure shattered uselessly against the stone. The entire courtyard went deathly still. Lyra lowered her hand, her eyes shifting to the terrified vampire lord. Get away from my mate. The pillar of white ash that used to be Gideon drifted to the bloody cobblestones. The sheer impossibility of the moment finally fractured Severin's arrogant composure. He stared at the ash, then slowly dragged his pitch-black eyes back to Lyra. The cloying scent of vanilla soured into the stench of fear. You. Severin hissed, his fangs fully extended. You're nothing but a runt. A stolen battery. He gripped the hilt of his broadsword with both hands and lunged. He moved with the blinding speed of an immortal predator, the jagged steel arcing straight for Lyra's neck. Her body moved on instinct. She didn't dodge. She simply reached out her bare hand and caught the razor-sharp edge of the blade mid-swing. The brutal momentum of the strike shattered the stones beneath her feet, but Lyra didn't flinch. The heavy steel ground against her palm, yet no blood spilled. Instead, a blinding violet heat erupted from her skin. Severin gasped. The ancient metal of the broadsword hissed violently, glowing white-hot and melting like wax over Lyra's fingers. "I am not a vessel," Lyra whispered. She closed the distance, her glowing hand shooting forward to lock brutally around Severin's throat. The physical strength of the dormant wolf surged through her muscles, lifting the vampire lord completely off his feet. He clawed desperately at her arm, the cold radiating from his skin evaporating instantly against the blistering heat of her magic. "You drank from me for 22 years, Lyra murmured, staring directly into his terrified eyes. "Let's see how much of my power you can actually swallow." She unleashed the fire. Pure lunar magic flooded from her grip straight into Severin's veins. It was too bright, too ancient. The heavy scent of burning vanilla and ozone choked the courtyard. Severin threw his head back in a silent, agonizing scream. Violet light exploded from his chest, fracturing his porcelain skin like shattered glass. Then he simply crumbled. The vampire lord disintegrated into a cloud of fine gray dust that slipped through Lyra's fingers and carried away on the freezing wind. The monster was dead. Lyra slowly lowered her empty hand. A heavy, ringing stillness settled over the bloody courtyard. The surviving vampire vanguard dropped their weapons and fled blindly into the dark tree line. Lyra turned slowly. Kaelen was still on his knees in the center of the slaughter, his massive form covered in weeping wounds and soaked in the rotting venom of Gideon's blade. He let out a jagged growl, his milky white feral eyes locking onto her. He didn't see the woman who had just saved the world. He saw the blinding light of a predator encroaching on his territory. The beast lunged. The sheer force of his massive body slamming into her sent them both crashing backward onto the frozen stones. Kaelen pinned her down, baring his terrifying jaws, aiming a lethal strike directly at her exposed throat. Lyra didn't fight back or summon the fire to burn him. She reached up, tangling her fingers deep into the matted fur at the nape of his neck, pulled his massive head down to her chest, and wrapped her arms completely around him. "I've got you," she whispered. "I'm right here." She let the unconditional warmth of her magic bleed into his corrupted skin. It wasn't the violent fire that had destroyed Severin. It was a soft, pulsating tide of moonlight. It sank deep into his veins, hunting down the black rot of the feral curse and dissolving it completely. Heat. The frantic thumping of a failing heart. Lyra held tighter, pressing her cheek against his snout. "Come back to me, Kaelen." The massive beast suddenly went rigid. A brutal shudder racked his entire frame as the terrifying lichen form began to violently shrink. Bone cracked and reset, thick fur melting away into scarred skin. The suffocating scent of dark magic evaporated, replaced by the intoxicating scent of damp earth and pine. The massive weight crushing her softened. Kaelen lay sprawled across her chest, entirely human. His broad shoulders heaved as he dragged in a desperate breath. Weakly pushing himself up on his forearms, he stared down at her, his rugged face slack with exhaustion. The milky white voids were gone. His eyes were a piercing, perfectly clear gold. "Lyra," he breathed, his voice cracking perfectly around her name. The dark canopy of the night finally began to fracture. Lyra sat up on the cold stones, pulling Kaelen's exhausted frame against her side. She draped her woolen cloak over his bare shoulders, her fingers resting gently over the steady rhythm of his healed heart. Footsteps crunched against the slush. The surviving members of the Blood Moon Pack emerged from the shadows. Enforcers, elders, and young wolves moved slowly, their eyes darting from the piles of vampire ash to the glowing residual magic still tracing Lyra's skin. They didn't draw their weapons. They didn't cower. As one fluid movement, the entire pack dropped to their knees in the snow. They bared their throats in a display of absolute, unquestioning submission to the woman who had ripped their alpha from the jaws of the feral dark. Kaelen shifted against her. He forced his battered body upward. Lyra reached out to steady him, but he gently brushed her hands away. He didn't stand. He shifted his weight, driving one knee deeply into the frozen dirt and looked up at her. The flash of her old vision slammed into place. Thus, a feral beast, a king feared by gods and men, bowing his massive head. But it wasn't a vision of conquest, it was a vow. My life, Kaelen rumbled, his deep voice carrying across the silent courtyard. My pick, my soul. They are yours to command. You are my equal in all things. My queen. Lyra's breath hitched. The phantom wolf inside her didn't snarl. It curled up contentedly beside the heavy warmth of its mate. She reached out, sliding her small hand into Kaelen's calloused palm. He laced their fingers together, his grip an unbreakable iron tether. Rise, Kaelen, she whispered softly. He stood, pulling her effortlessly to her feet and wrapped his heavy arm around her waist. The sheer, radiating heat of him chased the last of the winter chill from her bones. Lyra looked up. Over the jagged peaks of the forbidden wastes, the sun broke the horizon. The suffocating darkness of her 22 years shattered as brilliant streaks of gold, violent bursts of pink, and a sprawling canvas of impossible blue flooded the world. She finally knew the color of the sky. The morning air smelled of crushed pine, melting snow and rain-soaked earth. Lyra leaned her head against Kaelen's chest, her eyes fixed on the horizon, entirely and completely free.